In a small, forgotten town nestled deep in the misty woods, there was an old mansion that had stood for centuries. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed whispers, warning their children never to stray too close. It was a place where shadows lingered long after the sun had set, where the air was thick with secrets, and where the past never seemed to fully let go. At the edge of the town, the mansion loomed, a relic of a bygone era. Its once grand facade was now crumbling, ivy creeping up the stone walls, and its windows, long since shattered, stared out like hollow, empty eyes. But despite its decrepit state, the mansion was not uninhabited. Inside lived a solitary woman known only as Eleanor, the seamstress. Eleanor had lived in the mansion for as long as anyone could remember. Some said she had always been there, as old as the house itself. Others claimed she had come from somewhere far away, bringing with her the skills of a master seamstress and the curse of an ancient, dark magic. But no one knew for sure, for Eleanor rarely ventured into town, and when she did, she kept to herself, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a heavy veil. The few who had seen her up close spoke of her eyes, deep, dark, and unsettling. They claimed that when she looked at you, it felt as though she could see straight into your soul, unearthing all your fears and desires. But those who had glimpsed beneath the veil told an even stranger tale, that Eleanor had no real eyes at all. Instead, where her eyes should have been, there were buttons, black as coal and just as cold. Eleanor was a mystery, an enigma shrouded in darkness. She lived alone in the mansion, her only companions the countless dolls and mannequins that filled every room. These dolls were her creations, meticulously crafted with exquisite detail, each one unique and lifelike in a way that made them almost unsettling. They were her pride and joy, the fruits of her labor as a seamstress and doll maker. But there was something off about these dolls, something that made people uneasy. Their eyes, in particular, were unnervingly realistic, almost as if they had once belonged to someone else. The townsfolk avoided the mansion, fearing the stories that surrounded Eleanor and her dolls. But one day, a young woman named Claire, new to the town and unaware of the old legends, found herself drawn to the mansion. She was a seamstress herself, a craft she had inherited from her grandmother, and she had heard whispers of Eleanor's unmatched skill. Driven by curiosity and the hope of learning from the master seamstress, Claire decided to pay Eleanor a visit. The day Claire arrived at the mansion, the sky was overcast, and a thick fog had settled over the town, obscuring the path ahead. As she approached the mansion, the air grew colder, and an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. But Claire was determined, and she knocked on the heavy wooden door. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. Claire hesitated, but a voice from within called out to her, soft and melodic yet tinged with something darker. "Come in, my dear." Claire stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a soft thud. The interior of the mansion was grand, but it had fallen into disrepair. Dust covered the floors, and the air was thick with the scent of age and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with spools of thread, bolts of fabric, and dozens upon dozens of dolls. They stared down at Claire with their glassy eyes, their expressions eerily lifelike. At the end of the hallway, in a room lit only by the faint glow of a fire, stood Eleanor. She was tall and thin, her movements graceful yet unsettling. Her face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and her hands, delicate and pale, were busy sewing the final stitches on a doll's dress. She looked up as Claire entered, her eyes hidden in shadow. "Welcome," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as silk. "What brings you to my home?" Claire swallowed her unease and introduced herself, explaining her admiration for Eleanor's work and her desire to learn from her. Eleanor listened quietly, her head tilted slightly to the side as if she were studying Claire. "So you are a seamstress too?" Eleanor said softly. "And you wish to learn from me?" Claire nodded eagerly, her initial fear beginning to wane as her passion for the craft took over. "Yes, I've heard so much about your skill. I'd be honored to learn from someone as talented as you." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Very well, my dear. You may stay here and learn." But know this, the work we do here is not just about sewing and stitching. It requires dedication, patience, and an understanding of the fabric of life itself. Claire agreed, too eager to realize the full weight of Eleanor's words. She was given a small room on the second floor of the mansion, overlooking the vast, overgrown garden. The room was simple but comfortable, furnished with a bed, a small desk, and a chair. On the wall opposite the bed was a large, antique mirror, its surface slightly tarnished with age. That night, as Claire settled into her new surroundings, she noticed something peculiar about the mirror. Whenever she looked into it, she felt as though the reflection was slightly off, like it was watching her, studying her movements. She brushed it off as nerves and exhaustion, convincing herself that it was just her imagination. The next day, Eleanor began teaching Claire the finer points of her craft. They spent hours in the sewing room, where the air was thick with the scent of fabric and the sound of needles piercing cloth. Eleanor was a meticulous teacher, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting their craft. As the days turned into weeks, Claire's skills improved under Eleanor's watchful eye. But as she delved deeper into the craft, she began to notice strange things happening around the mansion. The dolls that lined the shelves seemed to move on their own, their positions subtly different each time she entered a room. Sometimes she would hear faint whispers coming from the walls, or catch a glimpse of a shadow flitting across the hallway. One evening, while working late in the sewing room, Claire noticed something odd about the fabric she was using. It was soft and supple, unlike any material she had ever worked with before. It had a strange warmth to it, almost as if it were alive. When she asked Eleanor about it, the older woman merely smiled and said it was a special fabric, one that required great skill to handle properly. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the fabric than Eleanor was letting on. Her curiosity piqued, she decided to investigate further. Late one night, after Eleanor had retired to her room, Claire sneaked into the sewing room and began searching through the shelves and drawers. She found a locked cabinet hidden in the corner of the room, its door secured with a heavy padlock. Driven by a growing sense of unease, Claire picked the lock and opened the cabinet. Inside, she found stacks of fabric, each piece neatly folded and labeled. But as she examined them closer, she realized with horror that the fabric was not cloth at all. It was human skin, carefully tanned and preserved. Claire recoiled in shock, dropping the bundle of skin she had been holding. Her mind raced as the full realization of what she had discovered began to sink in. The dolls, the whispers, the strange occurrences, everything began to make a terrible kind of sense. Eleanor wasn't just a seamstress, she was something far darker, something monstrous. Suddenly, Claire heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Panicking, she quickly shut the cabinet and hid behind a nearby curtain. Eleanor entered the room, her movements deliberate and measured. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room before she approached the cabinet. "You shouldn't have done that, Claire," Eleanor said softly, her voice filled with a chilling calm. "You shouldn't have gone snooping." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she remained hidden, trying to keep her breathing quiet. But Eleanor seemed to know exactly where she was. The older woman reached out and yanked the curtain aside, revealing Claire's terrified face. Eleanor's expression was unreadable as she looked down at Claire. Her hat cast a shadow over her face, but in the dim light of the sewing room, Claire could see the glint of the buttons that served as Eleanor's eyes. "I told you, this work requires understanding," Eleanor continued, her tone almost gentle. "It's not just about sewing. It's about creation, about life and death." Claire tried to back away, but Eleanor grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Please let me go," Claire pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "You wanted to learn, my dear. And now you will. You'll learn what it truly means to be a seamstress, to craft something from nothing, to bring life to what was once lifeless." With that, Eleanor dragged Claire to the sewing table and forced her into a chair. The older woman began to hum a strange, haunting tune as she gathered her tools, needles, thread, and a pair of sharp scissors. Claire struggled, but Eleanor held her in place with an unnatural strength. The buttons in Eleanor's eyes seemed to glisten with a malevolent light as she leaned in close. "You've seen the truth, Claire," Eleanor whispered, her breath cold against Claire's skin. "Now you'll become part of it." Eleanor began her work with a terrifying precision, her hands moving swiftly and skillfully. Claire felt a sharp pain as the needle pierced her skin, followed by a strange numbness that spread through her body. She wanted to scream, to fight, but she was powerless against the dark magic that held her in place. As the hours passed, Claire's consciousness began to fade. She felt herself slipping away, her thoughts growing distant and fragmented. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Eleanor's face, the buttons in her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. When Claire awoke, she was no longer in her own body. She was trapped, her consciousness confined within the cold, lifeless form of the doll. She could see and hear everything around her, but she was unable to move, unable to speak. The sensation was suffocating, her mind screaming in silence as she tried to break free. Eleanor stood before her, holding the doll that was now Claire in her hands. The older woman's expression was serene, almost tender, as she placed the doll on a shelf alongside the others. "There now," Eleanor said softly. "You're perfect, my dear. Just perfect." And so, Claire became one of Eleanor's creations, her soul bound to the doll for all eternity. She joined the ranks of the other dolls, each one a victim of Eleanor's dark magic, each one trapped in their own silent nightmare. The mansion on the edge of town remained a place of fear and mystery, its secrets known only to those who dared to venture too close. The townsfolk continued to speak of Eleanor, the seamstress with button eyes, warning their children to stay far away. And inside the mansion, Eleanor continued her work, creating new dolls, each one more lifelike than the last. But no matter how many dolls she made, no matter how perfect they were, Eleanor could never fill the void within her, the void left by her own lost humanity. For she, too, was cursed, trapped in a cycle of creation and destruction, forever bound to the dark magic that had claimed her eyes and her soul. And so, the seamstress with button eyes lived on, her work never finished, her dolls never complete. The mansion on Maple Street remained a place of horror, its halls echoing with the silent screams of those who had fallen victim to the seamstress's needle and thread.